Welcome everyone to our second and final session of a 3-minute thesis presentation today. I'm Francis Mignot. I'm a research associate in Marie-Josée Hébert's lab in Montreal, and also a co-lead for the CDTRP's education and training platform. So I will be moderating this session today. So for the next hour and a half, we'll hear from the next generation of the nation and transplantation researchers as CDTRP trainees and other trainees from across Canada presenting their research at the 3-minute thesis. So today's session is focused on CDTRP teams 1, 2, and 5. And each trainee will have 3 minutes to present their research in a maximum of 3 slides. And we'll follow this with 2 minutes of Q&A questions answer. And the trainees are highly encouraged to participate at this session in virtual and in person to ask questions to your peers. I think it's a great exercise for all of you guys, so it's important to participate. Of course, the best part is that you're gonna be able to evaluate your peers, and we'll have a $250 award at the end of the day at the dinner for the best presentation. So please use the QR code in the sessions program to access the anonymous scoring guide. If you don't have the QR code in front of you, you can access it directly on the website. For our virtual participants, I will be in charge of the Q&A too. So I will take a question from the stage for in-person and virtual. So the presentation will be evaluated on different content. So the comprehension and content, which include presentation, will provide clear background and significance to the research question. Presentation clearly describe the research strategy, design, and the results findings of the research. And the presentation clearly describe the conclusion, outcomes, and impact of the research. You will also evaluate on engagement and communication, which includes the oration was delivered clearly and the language was appropriate for a non-specialist audience. The PowerPoint slide was well-defined and enhanced the presentation. And finally, the presenter conveyed enthusiasm for their research and capture and maintain the audience's attention. Each of these will be evaluated on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being poor and 5 excellent. Follow the survey as we go to the evaluation, the presentation live. All right, let's get started. So our first speaker is Alexandra Frankel, a PhD student in anthropology at York University, presenting embodied survivorship using heart-based methods to complicate biomedical narrative of organ transplantation and improve care.
The discourses and words that biomedical contexts and traditional qualitative interviews elicit do not always make space for the intricacies of lived transplant experience. Psychiatrist and medical anthropologist Arthur Kleinman highlights the abstracting tendencies of both biomedical and social scientific language. This process of abstraction can result in a flattening of the body into data points. Of course, these data points are essential to care and medical interventions. At the same time, embodied knowledge is essential to understanding the textures of transplant experience that are in turn critical to developing impactful psychosocial supports. Arts-based methods have the potential to play a critical role in facilitating the development of embodied and sensory knowledge. Having emerged concurrently with qualitative research and therapy circles, these methods are highly adaptable to trauma-informed research. Further, they center participant experience and create the space for the kinds of utterances that are difficult to articulate and the kinds of utterances that don't fit into a coherent narrative. That is, arts-based methods makes the disclosure of different kinds of words possible. In the friction study, we used an exercise called Below the Surface. It is the second of 3 interviews, and it starts with a scribble in, like we did this morning, followed by an exploration of the sensory experiences related to transplant. In this exercise, the participant makes and transforms an aluminum cast using the art materials we provide. The cast serves as a container for the experience, and the role of the researcher becomes to notice back in what becomes an exploration, a co-exploration of the cast. One participant's cast foregrounded the complexities of exercising control and autonomy over one's own body in the ICU. When I noticed the red string that she had decisively reached for, she responded, "They are all the IVs and the scars and the marks. I had IVs put in my arms, with 2 arms over my head, and they didn't feel like my arms for a long time. When I noticed the blue squiggly lines," she said, "I remember all this wetness and feeling like no one was listening to me, that I needed dressing changed. I literally was soaked in bed for hours and no one came." This exercise cracks open the epistemic constraints of language in biomedicine and qualitative research, providing glimpses into different forms of knowledge. Embodied experiences unfold between lab tests, imaging studies, and biological therapies. Improving psychosocial supports requires directing attention to these in-between spaces, and arts-based methods provide important insights in this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Any question? So while we're waiting for questions from the assistants, I have one. So could this hard project could be applied to a donor family to help with the grieving process?
That's a really interesting question. I think it certainly could be. There's so much grief in many forms and so much trauma that takes many forms that I think this methodology and modality is equipped to deal with, so long as you do it right. I should mention that I co-conduct these interviews with an art therapist because that is part of our trauma-informed ethic in this project.
Thank you.
Great question.
There you go.
Hi there. The people that you're using, that you're doing this method with, are they normally pro art and very artistic people or no?
No, so we've had a mix of people. Some people have artistic experience, some people do not. And we designed the activity in such a way that it was accessible. And so when we're working in situ in the interview, we refer to it as mark making more so than art making in order to sort of take the stress away from, you know, the idea of making high art.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? So thank you.
Thanks.
So our next speaker is Wajiha Ghazi, MSc student in medical science at the University of Toronto, presenting on physical function impairment among patients on dialysis and kidney transplant recipients.
Walking, doing household chores, and climbing stairs. These are some of the activities of daily living, and the functional ability to perform these activities is called physical function. People with chronic kidney disease are reported to have poor physical function, especially patients on dialysis. They're reported to have low stamina, lower muscular strength as compared to kidney transplant recipients. Here, we're looking at physical function impairment among patients on dialysis and kidney transplant recipients. Why physical function impairment? Because physical function impairment is associated with frequent hospitalization, poor health-related quality of life, and mortality. And currently, the number of patients receiving dialysis or transplant are increasing by 2.5 million, and this number is expected to double to 5.4 million by 2030. Despite these numbers and compelling evidence, there is no systematic approach to assess physical function of this patient population in clinical settings. One way to do so is through patient-reported outcomes. And here we're using patient-reported outcome measurement information system, in short, the PROMIS tool. The PROMIS tool is precise efficient, and it reduces the question burden as it tailors the question based on the response of the patient and then presents the next question that's relevant to the patient. So in this cross-sectional study, a total of 740 participants were included. Patients completed questionnaires on an iPad. We collected the clinical variables through medical records. We assessed their ability to walk through the EQ5D5L mobility dimension, and PROMIS physical function T-score was categorized. So usually the PROMIS T-score is scored on a scale of 20 to 80. The higher the score, the better the physical function, with 50 being the general population mean. So a T-score of less than 40 was considered moderate physical function impairment, and a T-score of less than 35 was considered severe physical function impairment. And as expected, we found that in our cohort, kidney transplant recipients had better physical function with a mean T-score of 47, and dialysis patient had a lower physical function T-score of 36. And we saw that the dialysis group showed higher moderate and severe physical function impairment as compared to the transplant group, and they also reported more problems in walking. So in the future, we're planning to compare the PROMIS physical function scores with performance-based measures, and also conduct exercise interventions to see if we can reverse physical function impairment. And lastly, improve the interpretability of physical function T-scores for both clinicians and patients. And in terms of the impact, we're hoping that these tools can be integrated into clinical settings to assess a routine physical function assessment for risk stratifications of waitlist transplant recipients, and also to refer patients for pre or rehabilitation before or after transplant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any question? So while we're waiting, I have a question.
Yep.
Are you surprised by the number of patients that has some moderate, severe, or even problem walking impairment in the transplant group? I found the results kind of relatively high, considering that after a transplant.
They got a transplant. So, so part of the reason for this is to have the conversation between the patient and the provider about improving physical function. So even after transplant, transplant recipients do not engage in physical activity, even though after surgery, there's a short-term physical inactivity, but that behavior prolongs. And so, you know, in long term, their physical function also decreases. So even if you look at the literature or even our results, it's quite similar. Even though the kidney transplant recipients have better physical function, they're still lower than the general population mean.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the talk. This is really interesting.
Yeah.
In considering sort of future interventions, do you hypothesize that most of the members of your cohort will require very similar interventions? Or do you think there's merit in using people's PROMIS survey results to identify subpopulations that may require unique trajectories of intervention to yield the most benefit?
So we are currently planning a multimodal interventions to see what will be appropriate for dialysis patients and for transplant. So we will see accordingly. We're currently in the process for that. So thank you.
Cool, thanks.
No problem.
Hi, thank
Hello.
you for talk. I have two related questions. The first one is about the timing when you actually ask patients to report back with the PROMIS questionnaire. And the second is if you had any patient partners analyze the data with you during your.
Yes, so the data that I presented today was only assessed at one time point. So there was no different time points that we analyze. So this was patients who are currently undergoing dialysis or those who received transplant. So we had patients who received transplants, 5 years ago or 4 years ago, or also recent. And in terms of your second question, we do meet our patient partners twice a year when we go through the results and discuss further interventions.
Do you analyze differently depending on the timeline between the transplant and the time they answered the questionnaire?
In our current study, which is a longitudinal study, there we will be doing that for our cross-sectional study where we just assess the physical function in one time point. We don't, but here we assessed their time since transplant and also the time they went through dialysis, even considering the time that they've been through the treatments. The study results were still significant, and we saw the same results. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Oh, yep.
So our next speaker is Manoela Ferreira, who is presenting on behalf of her team that includes Marie-Hélène Normand and Sandrine Juillard. These three are one of the two groups that participated in CDTRP's trainee publication working groups, whose goal was to research and publish on an understudied area in donation or transplantation research. So Manoela recently completed our postdoc fellowship at the University of Toronto. Marie-Hélène is a PhD student, and Sandrine is a master's student in the microbiology and immunology program at the University of Montreal. So today they will be presenting the effects of telerehabilitation on physical function, mental health, and health-related quality of life in solid organ transplant recipients. A systematic review.
Good evening. This is your breaking news with real-time updated information presented by Manoela, Marie-Hélène, and Sandrine. And today we are with some great news for you. As scientists from Canada say, telerehabilitation for solid organ transplant recipients is feasible and safe with a wide range of possibilities as technology grows. This is your breaking news from a CDTRP group. Sandrine, please welcome. Can you please talk more about your review procedures?
Hello, Manoela. So since COVID-19, many studies and regular clinical practices in a rehabilitation center have pivoted from in-person to remote or hybrid rehabilitation, but we were not sure about the evidence of telerehabilitation for solid organ transplant recipients. We conducted a systematic review, which is the highest level of evidence. We searched over 600 documents and found 20 studies on telerehabilitation. Most of the papers were done before COVID, which shows us that this topic was not new.
Oh, wow. And Marie-Hélène, speaking a little more about your findings, when you say solid organ transplant recipients, which are the organs you were talking about? And can you please talk more about the most common effects of telerehabilitation?
Hi, Manoela. So we included studies involving heart, liver, kidney, lung, and pancreas recipients. And in total, 969 participants were enrolled. And the effects of telerehabilitation were usually measured during an in-person assessment. And the most common improvements were on cardiopulmonary capacity, body composition, frailty, and quality of life. So no adverse events were reported, but it was not possible to compare studies as the study designs and procedures were too different.
Great work. And Sandrine and Marie-Hélène, how do you describe the telerehabilitation program and how it was delivered? Do you think it's still feasible since after COVID?
So the telerehabilitation models were really diverse, from a mix of in-person and remote exercise, supervised or not, and focusing on cardio and strength exercises. The intervention duration was from 8 weeks to 6 months, and the delivery was done through apps, website, or video conferencing.
Also, one of the papers in this review shows the adjustments that a lung rehabilitation center made to incorporate a virtual rehab option into their routine. So the information provided in this review is still valid, as it shows many possibilities of telerehab. And we hope that with more technological advances, we can create more rehab opportunities.
As telerehabilitation seems feasible, we expect to have more studies with patients, family, and donors using smart technology and Bluetooth connection and digital information to promote safe and efficient telerehabilitation for solid organ transplant recipients. This is your breaking news with Manoela, Sandrine, and Marie-Hélène. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
So I just want to say that I was a television reporter for 20 years. So
Oh my
great
God.
job, you guys. You did a really great job.
Thank you.
I do have a question about, well, two things. One, did the studies include any pediatric studies? And the other thing is, after this morning's talk about exercise, the MedBike study and kids, getting kids, transplant kids to exercise, my thought was, what about interventions that involve the entire family, or in the case of adults, like their partners? Because I think, as we all know, that when you exercise together with somebody, that your chances of success are higher. So is that an area that you guys are looking at or have looked at, or did you see any of that in any of your studies?
Well, amazing questions. And speaking about the first one, this systematic review is focused in adults, but we do collected information about pediatrics, and we want to have a paper for them as well, because usually it's like a piece of the paper is about pediatrics, but we want to focus in and understand what the findings are, because usually the studies are very diverse when we talk about pediatrics. But I would say they have much more humanity in there. So I think it will be a very nice place to explore and to see. And speaking now a little bit about the interventions, they were very diverse, from in-person sessions at the beginning to remote sessions where patients were able to exercise by their own or with their parents or their family or friends. Now, as technology, it's much more available, especially since after COVID. Now I can see group sessions where we can together motivate each other. So for sure, I think the most part of these studies were done before COVID, where Zoom, Teams, things like that were not much available. So I think at that time, they were not thinking about remote group sessions, but now I think it is possible, and it should be a part of the program, because it's not fair to, to exercise, you need motivation and people help. So the way I see telerehabilitation, I see building a community where people can exercise together, even though each one in their home. And using sometimes the minimal equipment to make it more affordable and feasible for people.
So for the sake of time, a quick question and a quick answer.
Oh, sorry.
I'll condense it really significantly. Being a virtual program, do you not have any concerns about, you mentioned injury, maybe not doing exercises correctly because they're doing it remotely versus being supervised in person?
Amazing question. And yes, as a physiotherapist, I care about how patients are doing exercise, because if you do it wrong, you can have an injury. So in these studies, they did not report any adverse event. So patients were able to complete the entire program, and they had improvement on physical outcomes, and a few were reporting outcomes, improvements on mental health, but none of them are reporting issues in terms of falling or things like that. But in the future, I think we need to have in-person sessions and guide exercise, and then virtual sessions where we watch patients and we provide tips regarding how they can perform the exercise. I think also the use of smart technology will be great to measure heart rate, oxygen saturation, things like that, that we don't see but are interfering in our patients' performance and health. So yeah, and we also have some shirts now that can help patients correcting their posture while they are exercising, and they also monitor heart rate, oxygen saturation. So I think in the future it will be nice to incorporate these features to the rehabilitation to make it more affordable, feasible for all, and for sure we need to work on affordability because some of them are still expensive.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Ami Thachil, a master's student from the University of British Columbia, presenting on investigating serum immunometabolomic profiles associated with pediatric kidney transplant alloimmune outcomes.
Following kidney transplantation, some children can develop chronic forms of rejection that reduce the lifespan of their transplant and negatively impacts their quality of life. Now imagine for a second if we were able to predict the risk of rejection before a patient's transplant had even occurred. Well, our work looks at doing just that, using a platform known as metabolomics. So by interacting with the immune system, metabolism is able to influence transplant outcomes, either by promoting a more tolerant regulatory type response or a more inflammatory rejection type response towards the transplant. In our work, we look to see if there are measurable differences in metabolism that can be used to predict whether someone will have a tolerant or rejection type response. To do this, we measure the concentration of small molecules known as metabolites in pre-transplant blood samples collected from children undergoing kidney transplant. These samples are collected, processed into serum, and biobanked. Metabolomics testing is conducted using a lab technique known as mass spectrometry that allows us to detect the concentration of 630 metabolites in each of the samples we've sent for testing. So our research group has previously identified patterns of metabolites that are associated with chronic rejection and poor long-term outcomes in adult kidney transplant recipients. And when we tested this adult model in children, we found that it was weakly associated with kidney transplant function. So on the graph on the left-hand panel over there, you can see along the y-axis, you have the kidney's ability to filter blood, the glomerular filtration rate, specifically at the 1 month post-transplant mark. And along the x-axis, you have the metabolite inflammatory risk score, which is derived from our model. Essentially, the higher the score, the greater the risk of inflammation and chronic rejection. And you can see that patients with a higher score tend to have a slightly lower ability to filter blood. Next, we wanted to see whether there were any variables that could be confounding in this relationship that we identified. And we found that patient age and size at the time of transplant, both of which are associated with kidney function, are also associated with our metabolite score. And going forward with metabolomics work in children, these variables might need to be taken into account. Finally, a third consideration from our work is sample quality. We found that several of the samples included in our analysis had high levels of lactate and low levels of glucose, which suggests that metabolism could have been ongoing during the pre-processing phase, going from whole blood to serum. And going forward with our work, we need to determine the extent to which these pre-processing factors influence the metabolite profiles that we are measuring. In terms of next steps, we are going to be developing a new metabolite model that is specific to children and independent of the effects of age and size. In terms of ultimately what we hope to accomplish with this work is to improve our understanding of chronic rejection risk in children and develop a way to identify those at highest risk. We hope that this will allow us to personalize treatment and intervention plans and hopefully prolong the life expectancy of the transplant and improve patient outcomes. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, that's bad. So pragmatically speaking, what does this sort of risk score provide clinicians? Put differently, if the metabolism predicts that a patient is likely to undergo sort of acute rejection, what types of interventions might a clinician provide in advance, and how would those differ from the types of interventions that a clinician might provide after the transplant if they notice that a rejection event is taking place?
So in terms of tailoring the treatment according to the risk profile that a platform like this could determine, I'm mostly speaking to perhaps tailoring an immunosuppression regimen and identifying those as high risk as perhaps needing a different immunosuppression regimen, and identifying those as low risk as potentially being candidates for being slowly weaned off of immunosuppression. Other potential types of interventions are perhaps diet or lifestyle factors that could be taken into consideration before a transplant has occurred.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. So we'll move to our next speaker.
Can I ask the question or no?
Got
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So our next speaker is Amal Trigui, a PhD student from the University of Sherbrooke, presenting on the longitudinal evolution of nutritional risk and muscle function of patients waiting for liver transplantation and the effect of early nutritional intervention following the transplantation. So just before starting, just like a small reminder, try to respect the 2-minute limit for fairness for all of you guys.
Okay, thank you. So just I'm from University of Montreal, not Sherbrooke.
Sorry.
No problem. Hi everyone. Imagine yourself in a store looking for tomato to cook your favorite meal after a hard day work. You find tomato, you go straight to checkout to pay it, but you find a very long line of people waiting to pay. You are so hungry, you start with maybe impatient, anxious, or a bit angry. Now imagine another person waiting as you, but instead of waiting to buy tomato, he's waiting to have a new liver, so his body could process normally his favorite meal. And instead of waiting few minutes, he's waiting months, even years. Patients with end-stage liver disease, they are waiting an average of 11 months to be transplanted. And during this waiting period, patients experience several feelings and complications, such as worry, fatigue, cognitive impairment, personality changes, itchy skin, bleeding in their gastrointestinal tract, abdominal swelling, malnutrition, lack of appetite, and decrease in their physical functionality. So this brought us to our first research question. What is the effect of waiting time on the nutritional status of the patient, his muscle function, and his quality of life? For that, we followed patients from their registration on the waiting list to be transplanted until liver transplantation. And our project showed that the nutritional status of these patients worsened with the waiting time. And we finished with 95% of the patients are at risk of malnutrition. Their muscle function also decreased with the waiting time. And for quality of life, it is known that patients with end-stage liver disease, they have a decreased quality of life compared to the other population. But our project showed that the quality of life decreased also with the waiting time, especially the physical limitation component. So one day, our patient received a call. There is a new compatible liver available from him. The surgery went well. The patient is full of emotion of gratefulness, optimism, hope, and rebirth. The replacement of the diseased liver with a new one led to improvement in different metabolic disorders. But the nutritional status of the patient worsened after the surgery. He started to lose weight. He lost till 5 kilograms of his skeletal muscle. So we asked ourselves the question, what can we do to improve the nutritional status of the patient to increase his muscle function and improve his quality of life? For that, we decided to give transplanted patient nutritional supplementation rich in protein and energy for 12 months after the surgery. And we started as soon as they start solid food. The project is ongoing. We don't have enough patients today to confirm from you if the supplementation is effective to increase the nutritional status, muscle function, and the quality of life. But I can confirm for you that patients adhere very well to supplementation. And hopefully I'll be able to present the results of this phase next year in the CDTRP meeting. So stay tuned. And just before finishing, just a reminder that the purpose of liver transplantation, it's not only to prolong life, but also to increase the quality of life. So this is and will always be our main final purpose, to be sure that patients transplanted, they have quality of life after the surgery. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you. So I have a question. I don't think you mentioned it in your presentation, but in the abstract, you were saying that you're giving a high protein intake. You're planning to give a high protein diet for the patients. Could it be a problem for the kidney function if you're giving too much proteins in the long term?
It's not too much protein. We give them nutritional supplementation. It's available in commercial nutrition on Sur Protein Max. It is rich in protein, but we give them only 1 bottle per day. Okay. So they divide the quantity for time per day. It's not meant to replace a meal. They should eat normal meal, and in plus of that, it's supplementation to be sure that they have enough protein and to increase their muscle mass and prevent this decrease and deterioration in the muscle.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question?
Hi, Amal. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question about the assessments. So what tests did you use for muscle to assess muscular function and also quality of life?
We are using shared stand test to assess muscle function. The project is doing remotely. So I am assessing all patients to do the exercise virtually. And for quality of life, we are using SF36.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Quick question.
Not sure if those tests reflect this, but is there a frailty index that you align with this study?
We do not assess frailty in this project, but thanks for your question. But I'm working in another project right now in which we are assessing the long-term outcome after the transplantation. It means 1 year, 2 years, and even 3 years after the transplantation. And in this project, we are assessing frailty using questionnaire, frailty index, so we can see if there is always a high risk of frailty and sarcopenia after the surgery in the long term. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Chloe Wong-Mersereau, who recently completed a master in social cultural anthropology, presenting on expanding temporalities, complicating psychosocial tools for liver transplant survivals through critical discourse analysis and digital storytelling.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. So, what kind of story do transplant manuals tell? This project emerged out of interest in the transplant manuals that are given to patient, family, and donors as they prepare for their transplant journey. There currently exists little rigorous qualitative research on the psychosocial challenges of liver transplant recipients from a holistic perspective. Most of these studies use clinical scales and surveys to assess and quantify liver transplant recipients' quality of life, like the SF36, and their psychosocial challenges. So this project examines 2 main research questions in attempts to expand the depth of qualitative research on the psychosocial challenges of liver transplant recipients. First, we ask what remains unexplored in the qualitative research on the experience of surviving liver transplantation. And secondly, what kinds of futures materialize when transplant medicine is brought together with a critical arts-based approach that questions presupposed notions of futurity, cure, livability, and thriving. Methodologically, this project engages with multimodal ways of analyzing, producing knowledge from a discourse analysis using qualitative software like NVivo 12, in addition to engaging seriously with the sounds, sights, smells of recipients' experience with transplantation. We found that these transplant materials and psychosocial tools tell a linear story about the transplant experience with a distinct beginning, middle, and end. This linear structure has serious implications for preparing potential transplant recipients, families, and donors because they do not represent the temporal psychosocial complexities of the recipient's experience pre, during, and post-transplantation. The language and structure commonly used in psychosocial assessments and quality of life scales become inattentive to the layers of time on the psychosocial challenges of recipients. One recipient reflected on becoming hyper-aware of time during their transplantation, saying time exists and it doesn't. They described how one can feel angry, resentful, and at the same time thankful and humbled at the whirlwind of activity that saved their life. This expands the idea of transplant time as something that is layered and fraught with contradictions instead of a chronologically linear experience. So clinical scales and patient manuals effectively flatten the experience of transplantation, whereas the multimodality of interviews and digital stories engages patients and people in ways that reveal
the important aspects of the psychosocial challenges that exist as one transplant journey evolves over time. Challenges that cannot easily be scaled or surveyed by psychosocial assessments. And so the critical discourse analysis paired with the digital storytelling complicates and expands conventional biomedical ways of knowing liver transplantation by opening these spaces and seriously engaging and witnessing with the tensions, frictions that arise with illness experience that have extended chronic temporalities. Thank you.
Thank you. So do we have any questions? Oh.
This is really, really interesting work. Thinking about normal and abnormal, sort of in air quotes, can this kind of work, or perhaps it has in your analysis, given insights on what that means to the people writing the transplant manuals versus what patients feel is normal and abnormal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's something that we're really kind of trying to disrupt and try to interject what these kind of cultural scripts are in terms of what consists of an ideal patient and what consists of the kind of ideal cure or recovery post-transplant, and what kind of language and structure is written into these manuals, and how kind of the patient perspectives and people's lived experience don't quite kind of map onto. Sometimes people have never been to a place where, you know, they have not necessarily a normal medical past, in the sense that they were always they weren't normally healthy in the same way that some of these narratives can kind of construct. And so there's they reach a point post-transplant where sometimes they're not necessarily in the healthiest place where they were told through these manuals. And so these expectations become a bit difficult to grapple with when there was one narrative clean and cut where you were once healthy, then you had a kind of painful present through this intense surgical experience, and then afterwards you will recover and be healthy again. But that's not always such a straightforward trajectory, right? And so kind of listening to those stories and kind of reconceptualizing those narratives in a sense where perhaps people were never in a state of quote unquote health and or ideal health to their abilities. And so now they're finding themselves grappling with that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So final group before the break features the second of the CDTRP Trainee publication working group. So they will be presenting today by Kifang Bey, PhD student, Princess Oko, master, and Aisha Adil, master student too, from the University of Toronto. So they will present an evaluation of indications are for genetic assessments in living kidney transplant donors and relevant Canadian practices in light of the current international guidelines.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So our story is on end-stage renal disease. It is a prevalent condition with a tendency to cluster within families of affected individuals. And with end-stage renal disease, living donor kidney transplant is the preferred and better treatment options with a higher long-term survival rate. However, in the United States, over 40% of living kidney donors are biologically related to their recipient. This increases the risk of the donors themselves in developing end-stage renal disease. With genetic testing of potential living donors, we hope to increase and improve risk assessment and inform the safety of donation. However, there is currently no clear recommendations of genetic testing for living kidney donors in the present international guidelines, and the current practice across Canadian transplant centers is unknown. So we have two aims, the first of which is to summarize the published international guidelines shown on this list, and to compare the indications for genetic assessment of living donors with underlying genetic kidney disease. And the second aim is to survey the current living donor genetic assessment practices of 23 adult centers across Canada, shown by the red dots on the map, which we currently have 13 responses. Our result currently shows that autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease, also known as ADPKD, Alport, and atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome, AHUS, are the most commonly and frequently encountered genetic kidney conditions for living donor assessment. And looking at one example questions on the right, if a 25-year donor who is related to an ADPKD recipient, what are the current tests that centers are doing? We see that most will do imaging, and some will do genetic testing of the recipient, while others will test the donor. But overall, the assessment methodologies are heterogeneous with no clear consensus. And while more centers have specific policies for donor evaluation of ADPKD and HUS, very few have policies for the other kidney disease, such as APOL1, ADTKD, sickle cell, Alport, and fibroid. So in conclusion, many centers across Canada follow a case-by-case approach rather than a standardized protocol for genetic assessment of living donors. While ongoing, this study will inform us on how evidence-based our Canadian practices are for kidney donor genetic assessment. And with this study, we want to thank Dr. Alam and CDTRP for their support. Thank you.
Thank you. So if we don't have any questions, I just have one about your presentation. So given that genetic tests could provide some information, medical information in the future, so the person not aware of, do you have any thought about the potential psychological distress, for example, for the families that are not aware of this kind of potential disease or?
Yeah, that's definitely something to be considered with all genetic testing, and that's the ethical side of stuff. So this will have to be taken with the social worker and psychologist, with the whole healthcare team to approach how we can assess. But with that has to be also be in consideration of how the risk towards the living donors. Is it really ethical if a donor we know has a high risk if they donate? Should we still allow them to donate if they do not want to know that? So that's definitely a question that will need to be in the works. And thank you for that question.
Thank you. So thank you. So we are done with the first part of the presentations. So welcome back, everyone. We'll continue with the presentation. So perfect. So our next speaker is going to be David Zorko, a pediatric critical care medicine fellow at the Hospital for Sick Kids, presenting on auto-resuscitation after circulatory arrest, an updated systematic review.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the organizing committee for this opportunity to share with you the results of this updated systematic review on the topic of auto-resuscitation. In organ donation after death determination by circulatory criteria, called DCD, an observation period of 5 minutes follows circulatory arrest to monitor for unassisted return of spontaneous circulation. And this has been termed auto-resuscitation. But to date, the evidence supporting this duration of observation period consists largely of small observational studies and case reports. Next, please. And therefore, the aim of this updated systematic review was to summarize the emerging evidence on auto-resuscitation, including the recent publication of 2 large observational studies. We followed a very standard and rigorous systematic review methodology, including risk of bias, uncertainty, and evidence assessments using GRADE. Next slide, please. Of 3,700 or just over 3,700 unique citations assessed for eligibility, we included 21 studies in our analysis. Next, please. We identified 14 new case reports of auto-resuscitation events and 7 observational studies that were included in our primary outcome analysis. Next, please. Amongst the case reports, there were some in the context of controlled withdrawal of life-sustaining measures and terminated cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And while you can see there's a wide range of time to autoresuscitation reported, please don't be scared. Only a subset of case reports described continuous monitoring of patients during circulatory arrest. Next, please. For our primary outcome, we had 6 observational studies that were conducted in the context of controlled withdrawal of life-sustaining measures, identifying 19 autoresuscitation events amongst a total of just over 1,000 study participants. And across all studies, the longest time to an autoresuscitation event was 4 minutes and 20 seconds. And given the strong association amongst this body of evidence, moderate certainty of evidence was adjudicated. We found no direct evidence in the context of controlled DCD. However, one observational study of 840 participants following failed resuscitation of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. There were 5 autoresuscitation events, with the longest time being 8 minutes. And despite this being a large study, important confounding factors to the 2 autoresuscitation events that occurred outside the 5-minute observation time led to low certainty of evidence. Next slide, please. And if you can just click through, because there's 5 summary statements here, but in summary, we found that the quality and quantity of evidence of autoresuscitation has grown. Given the importance placed on accurately determining death, this systematic review indicates that a 5-minute observation time is sufficient for death determination by circulatory criteria in the context of withdrawal of life-sustaining measures and DCD, supported by moderate certainty evidence. For uncontrolled DCD, this review suggests that a longer observation time may be needed, and these findings will be incorporated into a forthcoming Canadian guideline on death determination. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you. So I have a naive question. Could you explain the difference between a control versus uncontrolled DCD?
Yeah, for sure. And an important point of clarification here, since uncontrolled DCD is still a growing practice internationally, let alone in Canada. So controlled DCD is donation after circulatory death that happens in the context of controlled withdrawal of life-sustaining measures. So a decision has been made to withdraw life-sustaining measures, and then death occurs. So this is in the master's category. This is 3. And uncontrolled DCD refers to DCD that follows unsuccessful CPR, or if you're using master category terminology, that's category 2.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thanks for the talk. What is the evidence base regarding pediatric DCD, and what are the implications for practice? Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Thanks for that question. So pediatric DCD is still a growing practice because most of our organ donors have death determination by neurologic criteria. The evidence in autoresuscitation in pediatric patients is limited here to case reports. And we had 2 observational studies that enrolled a total of 12 pediatric patients following withdrawal of life-sustaining measures. 8 of them were DCD patients. So we didn't identify a lot of evidence, although currently there isn't much to indicate that we should think differently about this patient population. However, I know there's a growing group in Canada that are looking at this in terms of patterns of vital signs after death by circulatory criteria in the pediatric age group. So potentially more to come.
Thank you for your presentation. So we'll move to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Farnaz Farabasque, a master graduate in clinical sciences from the University of Western Ontario, presenting on the Iranian Donors Save Lives campaign to engage Iranian peoples as stem cell donors.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction. To begin, allogeneic hematopoietic stem cell transplantation is a curative therapy for a range of blood diseases. However, most patients lack a fully matched family donor and require an alternative donor. 8 out of 8 HLA-matched unrelated donor remains the preferred alternative donor source. However, there is marked racial disparity in access to unrelated donors. Specifically, Iranian peoples are underrepresented as donors and are needed to help patients in need of an allogeneic stem cell transplantation. To compare, while patients of European ancestry have a 75% chance of finding an 8 out of 8 HLA match unrelated donor, Iranian patients have a 40% chance of finding a suitable donor. Iranians make up roughly 1.1% of the population worldwide. However, they make up only about 0.2% of listed donors on the global stem cell registry. Due to the lack of representation of Iranians on the stem cell registry, the Stem Cell Club developed a campaign to engage Iranian peoples as stem cell donors. Next slide, please. This national campaign was the Iranian Donor Save Lives, which launched in April of this year, where multimedia resources, including infographics, patient stories, TikToks, testimonials, and physician statements, were created to engage and educate Iranians about stem cell donation. And these educational materials were developed in collaboration of more than 25 Iranian people. These resources were also translated to Farsi to increase inclusivity and relay effective communication within the Iranian community. Alongside a dedicated team of Iranian volunteers, we partnered with various collaborators who advocated and encouraged members of the Iranian community to get registered on the stem cell registry, including social media influencers, the Iranian Canadian Medical Association, over 5 Iranian student associations, and various communities from all across Canada. Next slide, please. In conclusion, an array of multimedia was developed to support the recruitment of Iranian people as potential stem cell donors and to reduce barriers to donation. Future steps in the project, which are currently underway, is to evaluate the effectiveness of the campaign through analysis of media impact, quantitatively through impact of knowledge and attitudes of potential donors from the Iranian community, and on reducing barriers to donation for Iranian peoples. And we will also analyze qualitative results in terms of perspectives of Iranian potential donors on the campaign. I'd like to thank my mentor, Dr. Warren Fingert, for his leadership as founder and director of the Stem Cell Club, as well as all stem cell donor advocates from the Iranian community. Thank you so much for having me and for listening.
Thank you. Do you have any question? I think so. So maybe while we are waiting for the question, maybe I missed it, but do you collaborate or are you aware of Swap the World that could be involved with this project?
Absolutely. Swab the World is, we also work with Swab the World. The Stem Cell Club is a national donor recruitment organization that is also collaborating with Swab the World.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Very interesting presentation. I'm just curious, you've obviously focused on the Iranian community at this stage. Is this something that you could take lessons learned and grow that to other communities as well? Is that something you've considered?
Absolutely. So the Stem Cell Club actually has campaigns for all different types of ethnic groups. We're really targeting ethnic minority groups. So we currently have representatives from different communities who are doing, saving lives with pride. So the LGBTQ community, South Asian donors save lives, Black donors save lives. So yeah, there's definitely different campaigns targeting different groups. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for your presentation. So we'll move to our next speaker, which is Selena Zhang, a medical student at the University of Toronto, presenting on the lay of the land in qualitative liver transplant research, scoping review and network mapping study.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for the introduction. So I don't know about everyone else, but in my experience, both doing research and preparing to be a doctor, I see numbers everywhere. What % of people had this outcome, or on a scale of 1 to 10, how did the patient rate their pain? So there are a lot of concepts that can be very effectively represented by numbers, but there are also concepts that can't be. And that's when qualitative research is so valuable. It's research that reports on experiences, on motivations, on opinions. But for reasons that I don't have time to hypothesize about today, there isn't much of this type of work published. So we are all here discussing transplant, a complex medical, social event that has a huge impact on a whole community. The recipient, the donor, caregivers, care providers, this impact may extend far before the procedure and last far beyond. Qualitative research in this field works to try and conceptualize this experience. But what we wanted to know is, what is the current literature saying about the range of issues the liver transplant community face? And as a supplement to that, whose experiences are we asking about? And is this field of research changing over time? Next slide, please. So what we did was cast a wide net, try to look for all the studies focused on liver transplant through a qualitative lens using a scoping review, whether that was through interviews, focus groups, and others discussing any adult population impacted by the procedure. Now, this is an ongoing study, so we haven't synthesized all the data from the publications we found yet. However, there are a few things to note so far. Not many studies use rigorous qualitative methods informed by critical theories. As well, we found many studies which sound promising, but actually focus on scales and surveys. Next slide, please. Something else we noticed is the lack of long-term data. Almost no studies continue to follow up beyond 1 year, despite the fact that with the hard work of many in this community, survival is often much longer, with different complications arising at different times. We also found tons of abstracts and aren't sure if this means that the qualitative work is being done, but not being published, or if there's a lot of work in progress, which would be great. So now the next steps for us are to wrap up the extraction of our data and work on a network map, like my trial on your bottom left. It helps show us who and what concepts are being talked about. Arguably more importantly, who and what concepts are being missed. We hope that for the future, our study can highlight what is missing in the literature's representation of the complex liver transplant experience to identify future avenues to explore. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Do we have any question? So I was wondering, based on the results of your study, are you planning to try to implement those missing qualitative?
Sure. So this study is actually sort of like a peek into what's out there to help inform other studies that are being done by our team, a few which actually spoke earlier, Chloe and Alexandra. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done by our team, but also just to highlight what's out there and what can be done by other experts in the field.
Thank you. So another question?
You mentioned you didn't have time in the talk to go over some of the barriers to this research. Do you want to make a comment on what you perceive to be some of the barriers?
Sure. And I'm going to say this anecdotally, I'm not like a complete pro, but I will say just from my background and like I had a basic science kind of medical background, there's often sort of like a disregard for qualitative. There's an idea that maybe it isn't as rigorous. It isn't as maybe even trustworthy. And often it's quite difficult to do as well. And because of that, I think there's a barrier to performing it. There's a barrier to getting funded for it, a barrier to getting published. So that's just a few ideas.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Sabil Schwantes, a registered nurse and PhD student at the University of Sao Paulo, presenting on time elapsed between cells, tissues, and organs donation and transplantation, and adverse events detection.
Thank you. Good evening here from Brazil. Adverse events in cells, tissues, and organ donation and transplantation are defined as any unfavorable situation that can cause damage to the recipient or living donor. A previous study developed in Brazil characterized causes of adverse events in the state with the highest number of transplant performed, that is São Paulo. This study, the main result is in the image in the screen, and it was result for my master research. However, analyzing this data, we observed the need to discuss the time and the specifics of the adverse events realized in every time between the procedure, the donation or transplant, the detection, and the notification of adverse events. So the objective of this study is to discuss the time between the transplant and the detection of the adverse events notified in São Paulo, Brazil. Next slide, please. Can you pass? Yeah. Was a descriptive study with a quantitative approach, and the data was provided by the Transplantation Center of São Paulo from the individual notifications form of adverse reactions in biovigilance between 2016 and 2019. The analysis was performed using descriptive statistics. 52 notifications were analyzed and 3 categories were formed. The first one, adverse events detected on the same day of transplant. There was neoplasms and infections and in hematopoietic stem cells recipients. The second category were adverse events detected between 1 week and 1.5 years after transplant, and were infections and other causes like surgical complications, and organs and hematopoietic stem cells recipient. In the third category was adverse events detected 2 years after transplants and were neoplasm and hematopoietic stem cells recipient. Can you pass? So this study highlights the need to investigate deeply related factors to adverse events, especially the time between the transplant procedure and the adverse event detection, to establish a clinical guideline, because it is necessary to understand what is considered an adverse event and what is the natural course of the patient's life, considering his specificities. This comprehension impacts in the clinical management of transplant recipients, decision-making, the public policies, patient safety and quality improvement research, and biovigilance. The full abstract can find in the QR code, and the reference can find in the QR code on the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions in the assistants? So could you comment actually on the potential related factors that could be involved with the adverse events?
In this study, we can see a lot of details of these related factors, but the main results show us that we need to understand what is if the outcome presented by the patient, it is related with the treatment, is the transplant or problem in the donation. So we need to investigate and improve the management of these adverse events to find this answer.
Thank you. Okay, so I thought we had a question in the virtual chat, but it seems it's something else.
Sorry, I did have a question, but when I tried to paste, just went wrong. My question to Sibel was just, do you have any data on the follow-up of those events?
No, it is a problem here, and I think when we analyze adverse events abroad, we have this problem. Another finding my master research is to compare these systems to notification systems of these adverse events, and this is a really problem. We don't have a management tool on a management protocol how to follow up these adverse events, and we need to improve that because it's an ethical question. It's our responsibilities as professionals working with that. We have here in Brazil, we have a regulatory organ that follow up this patient, but it's not public and we can access this data. So I think that the next steps is to improve this management process.
Thank you very much, Sibel, and sorry again for typing the wrong information in the chat about my shipment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Amina Silva, a registered nurse and PhD student at Queen's University, presenting on organ donation following medical assistance in dying, a scoping review.
So hello again, everyone. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. So today I'm going to briefly present the results from my scoping review in disease organ donation following medical assistance in dying. And that work has been led by Dr. Silvia Silva and funded by Canadian Blood Services. And the authors have no conflicts of interest to declare. So next slide, please. So I will be very short related to the background, as I know that most of you are going to be very familiar with all of the concepts I'm going to mention here today. And so even though the number of countries legalized MAID have been increasing around the world, currently only Canada, Netherlands, Belgium, and most recently Spain allow for controlled disease organ donation after the provision of MAID. So the first case of this dual procedure was performed in 2005 in Belgium. And since then, there have been a lot of heated debates around this dual procedure. So because of that, we decided to conduct a scope review. And the main aim of that review was to summarize the current state of evidence and practice regarding organ donation following MAID. Next slide, please. So for that review, we decided to use the JBI methodology for scope review. And after our searching process, we had a total of 121 articles that were included in the final reports of a review. And because we did have a large number of reports, we decided to divide our results in 3 different manuscripts. And I'm just going to very quickly give a highlight of each of those manuscripts for you guys. So in paper 1, we discussed the main process and procedures regarding organ donation following MAID. And that included the different clinical pathways. So for example, we could identify a clinical pathway for the provision of MAID where this process is started at home with subsequent death in the hospital setting and organ donation in the hospital setting. We identified clinical pathways for the dying process in the home of the patient and following organ donation in the hospital setting and the entire process in the hospital setting. And throughout this process, we also describe every specific procedures they have, including medications. So for paper 2, that was more related to the ethical and legal aspects of this dual process. So for example, what are the legislations in place worldwide for both MAID and disease organ donation, as well as what are the main ethical dilemmas, such as dying by donation, as well as whether children should be allowed to go through this dual procedure. And last but not least, our final paper reported on the outcomes from those recipients. So based on the results we had from the literature review, we could see that recipients from MAID donors, they have outcomes that are comparable to NDD donors, as well as usually those are superior to DCD donors. And all of those papers are currently under review, and we hope to publish that soon. So thank you very much. And I welcome any questions if you guys may have so.
Thank you. So do we have any question in the chat box or in person? Oh, so we do have one.
Just out of curiosity, do you see the MAID having an impact on the organ being donated, or is that doesn't matter? Like, it's curious.
So based on the results we had, it does not really matter. So because MAID, so those patients who go through donation after the provision of MAID, they are considered DCD donation. And because it is such a high level of a control environment, usually those outcomes are much better than traditional DCD because you have an exposure to ischemia time, which it is reduced when compared to other types of donation. So the outcomes for DCD after MAID were better than traditional DCD after withdrawal of life-sustaining measures and were comparable to NDD. So the results, but just again, this is a very new practice, so there are not a lot of publications on that. If I'm not wrong, it was about 15 papers published on those outcomes. So it may change in the future, but based on the current evidence, it shows pretty similar results.
Also, just out of interest, did you find any jurisdictions where they perform in situ perfusion in MAID, following MAID? I'm thinking abdominal normothermic regional perfusion, for example.
No, I think there is a publication from the Netherlands where they mentioned this process, but there was no transplantation following this. If I'm not wrong, it was only one paper. I can double check and even send for you. But if I'm not wrong, they just did the removal of the organ, but did not have transplantation to measure outcomes from this.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Cindy Wan, an undergraduate student in epidemiology and biostatistics from Western University, and she will be presenting on losing face as a potential barrier to living donor kidney transplantation for Chinese Canadians in Toronto, Ontario. Preliminary findings from a qualitative analysis.
Thank you. So chronic kidney disease affects approximately 1 in 10 Canadians and is characterized by 5 stages from normal kidney function to kidney failure. Patients with kidney failure require kidney replacement therapies of either dialysis or a transplant to survive. And of the available treatment options, living donor kidney transplantation, or LDKT, is the best possible option as it offers the best patient outcomes. Chinese Canadians represent the largest group of visible minorities, with approximately 1.8 million people, and are facing increasing rates of hypertension, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, which places them at a higher risk of developing CKD. And unfortunately, in Canada, East Asians are approximately 60% less likely to receive LDKT in comparison to white patients. Next slide, please. This disparity in access poses an important ethical and clinical concern. And in collaboration with Dr. Samantha Anthony's lab at Sick Kids Hospital, we investigated barriers and facilitators that may contribute to this inequitable access to LDKT for Chinese Canadians. We interviewed 31 individuals who self-identified as Chinese Canadian, both with and without lived experiences, meaning general community members, patients on dialysis, caregivers, living donors, and kidney transplant recipients. Our interviews were conducted in English, Mandarin, or Cantonese. Our study is still ongoing. However, the theme of losing face, or diulian, is clearly emerging from the data. Losing face is an important concept in Chinese and other traditional Confucian cultures related to the desire to maintain harmonious relationships and a positive social reputation by avoiding shame, which may be caused by, for example, failing social expectations and obligations. Losing face also appears to be a fluid concept that influences people's willingness to be open about matters such as illness, depending on their interpretation of the situation and what is worthy of losing face over. Next slide, please. Identified subthemes include 1, perception of illness as shameful. Participants described that open communication about illness to others outside of their primary social group might bring shame, so it is important to maintain privacy. 2, perception of illness as a personal responsibility. Participants explained that illness is expected to be managed privately to avoid imposing burden on others. Participants also expressed the perception that sharing information about illness serves no purpose as there is nothing others can do to help. And 3, burden of asking and anticipated need for reciprocity. Finally, participants shared that by asking for large gifts or favors, this may damage one's social reputation and require an act of reciprocity. They further described not knowing how to begin these types of conversations and not wanting to place pressure on others. Overall, communication about the need for a living donor is an essential step to pursuing LDKT, and concerns about losing face may pose a barrier to this process. It is therefore necessary to understand the way this concept influences communication about LDKT in order to develop culturally responsive resources and partners with our community partners that support safe and open communication about the need for a living donor within this population. Thank you.
Hi, that's really interesting research as a Chinese Canadian. And so I have a couple questions. One is, did you ask the participants if they were asked by a family member to donate a kidney, what their response would be? Because these are obviously reasons for why they didn't want to ask for a kidney. But if they were asked, would they say yes? So and I'd be curious to know if it's the same in the Chinese Canadian community as it is sort of generally in the population. And then also too, the the idea of asking, like, is there a way to do it? Like, what kind of tools, or is it just they just don't want to ask? Like, I mean, we often talk about wanting to translate things into other languages, but if it sounds like they don't even want to ask, then what's the point of translating a bunch of stuff? Like, that's not actually going to answer the problem here.
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking. I'll try to kind of break it down. So the first part, in terms of when family members asked them, most participants did express that if a family member or a really, really close friend did ask them, they would consider being a living donor, but they would not consider it to, people outside of that primary social group. In terms of comparison to the general population, I'm not entirely sure I can comment on that, just since I haven't had the opportunity to interview people, part of other ethnic cultural groups and kind of like comparing the differences there. And in terms of actually finding ways to communicate, we're still kind of trying to figure this out, since this is a preliminary analysis, and we're trying to find different ways on how this influences communication styles and what context this comes up most, and then kind of identify like points where we can address the issues there.
I just want to add, this is a very interesting study. I was wondering, like, on the communication piece, there's a lot of things or risk placed on the patient themselves to reach out and to talk about their illness, and it creates it makes people kind of relive or feel their weakness and their what they need, and to have to place their vulnerability on the forefront. I wonder if there's any sort of communication or strategies or workshop you're implementing or you're hoping to implement in that case. And another piece, in terms of your research, especially in terms of finding living kidney donors and in terms of patients, a lot of immigrants are coming in terms of one family or few people who are coming. Have you looked into the family dynamics and if there are living donors who are qualified and capable of donating? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So for the first part, in terms of actually creating interventions, like as I mentioned, this is a preliminary analysis, so we're still trying to, again, identify the specific contexts and the way this manifests in different individuals, because it also is quite subjective depending on what they value most. We are trying to create a website actually that has aspects of these findings intertwined and trying to use that to tackle this issue, but that is still under development. And in terms of looking at other factors like family dynamics and being immigrants, that is another theme that we're currently exploring in our research, but we haven't really, fully developed it, but that is something I hope to explore in the future.
Thank you. So our final speaker is Katina Zhang, a second-year internal medicine resident at the University of Toronto, presenting on live donor liver transplantation in primary sclerosing cholangitis, a negator of an organ allocation system not addressing patient need.
Thank you everyone for staying until the end tonight. The goal of my presentation today is to shed light on primary sclerosing cholangitis and the reliance on live donor liver transplantation. So primary sclerosing cholangitis is a progressive liver disease resulting in the fibrosis of bile ducts. Sorry, next slide. With the progression of liver disease, patients develop significant complications like cholangitis and pruritus, which limit their quality of life, and develop complications with liver cirrhosis like ascites and hepatic encephalopathy. Unfortunately, there are no great treatments for PSC, and liver transplantation is often life-saving and typically is required about 10 to 20 years post-diagnosis. As a result, these patients comprise some of the youngest populations served by adult liver transplantation. The MELD sodium score is used to allocate organs for liver transplantation, but has often been felt to disadvantage patients with PSC due to underweighing of the bilirubin, which is the primary manifestation of the disease. Exception points have been introduced for patients with recurrent cholangitis or medically intractable pruritus, because these patients' quality of life is significantly affected without being reflected in their MELD sodium score. So to better understand the clinical outcomes of these patients, we conducted a retrospective study of 172 patients diagnosed with PSC who were referred for liver transplantation at the University Health Network in Toronto over a 7-year period. Next slide. UHN performs a high volume of both deceased and living donor liver transplants per year. Of 172 patients referred for transplant, 84% were listed and 73% were transplanted during the follow-up period. We found that more patients with PSC underwent living donor liver transplant than deceased donor liver transplant at 60 and 40% respectively. This is far greater than the average of about 25% of patients who typically undergo live donor liver transplant across a broad range of indications. The majority of our patients had a potential living donor, and as a result, we found that these patients had improved outcomes. They had a lower MELD sodium at listing at 18 versus 21, a 76% lower chance of mortality overall. And when you look at the pie graphs here, there's a notable increase in the rate of transplant at 80 versus 46%, and a decrease in the rate of death on the wait list at 7 versus 31%. Overall, we found a higher rate and dependence on live donor liver transplant for patients with PSC than should be expected for other liver transplant indications, and a significantly increased survival and rate of transplant with access to potential living donors. Although the majority of patients underwent liver transplantation, much of this was as a result of a reliance on live donor liver transplantation, thus indirectly suggesting that the MELD sodium score may be inadequate in addressing the needs of patients living with PSC. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any question? So, are you planning to use AI, for example, to improve the to be more equitable with the donor allocation for those patients?
That's an interesting question. I'm actually working with Dr. Bat, who's my supervisor, on using AI for better allocation of organs and liver transplantation, not specifically for PSC, but certainly that would be an interesting kind of subpopulation to look at given our findings in this study.
Great. Thank you very much. So thank you to all of our speakers and everyone for your participation today to the and contributions to the discussion. So this concludes our 2-minute thesis presentation for the annual scientific meeting.